My name is Todd Kaneko, and I'm from Seattle, Washington. I came to Grand Rapids in it was 2007, 2008. I think it was 2008. And we came here because my partner and I had just finished grad school, and we were kind of just figuring out what do we do, and I was adjuncting, just teaching, on a semester by semester contract in Arizona at Arizona State where we were at. And she applied for a visiting gig at Grand Valley. And we were so surprised when she got it. And so I was like, well, let's go. And so we just picked up and moved out here because, it was a job. And so the job brought me to Michigan. It was a while ago, and we're still here. Yeah, Grand Rapids is home. We came here, we got married, we have kids, so we put our roots down here. I've always said home is where all my stuff is, right? And all my stuff is here in Grand Rapids. But more than that, Grand Rapids has been a really good place for me as an artist, as a teacher, and as a new dad. Man, it's been a great place for me. So it's funny. When I got to Grand Rapids, I was not writing poetry. When I got, I have a degree and I'm a Master of Fine Arts in creative writing, but my focus is in fiction. So I always tell people I'm hyper trained when it comes to narrative, right? But when it comes to poetry, man, I had to figure everything out myself. I haven't had that kind of education, those kinds of classes, that kind of coursework. So, we got here to Grand Rapids and I was teaching full time for the first time and trying to figure out how do you work as a writer and then somehow operate, in the real world without just losing everything, right? So often I'd be like stuck in the dream of a piece of writing, and I couldn't figure out how to get out of that. But I knew I needed to write, and poems were this way that like I can write these shorter things maybe instead of spending a month or 2 months on a draft. I can get through a draft in a day or two and enter and exit and then go back right to work and stuff like that. So it was probably about 2010 when I started writing poems, and it was a lot of me sitting down with the books that I had on my shelf, reading interviews with poets, talking to poets where I could, calling my friends who are poets and just trying to subtly asking them how the heck do you write poetry? So I learned how to be a poet, really. I learned how to write poetry while I was in the city. Right? So, when I think of when I think of my life as a fiction writer, man, that goes all the way back to Seattle, right? I started writing fiction probably 2000, probably right before the 2000s, 1998, 1999 is probably where I started to write fiction. But man, I really feel like this is the place where I figured it out, right? This is what poetry is. This is how I write, and this is where I'm comfortable. Poetry, man. Well, I've always said, people say, well, why do you write poetry? And I've always said, I want to make cool stuff. I still want to make cool stuff. It's so funny. People talk about poetry as like, well, it's the world filtered through language. And I agree. But I mean, there's a whole like mindset that comes with poetry. Once you start engaging with metaphor, once you start engaging with the way poems work as filters for the world, your brain starts working in this whole different way. At least that's how I see it, right? As I walk through the world, when I am immersed in poetry, when I'm thinking with my poetry brain, the world opens itself up. Like metaphor just like hits me everywhere, right? And the poems just are there in the world, right? Right? The poems are just there in the world, and you see them, and you're just like, oh, I want you, I want you, I want you. I just got to figure out how do I sit down and actually make that work happen, And that's just like, what is poetry? Poetry is magic because I get to look at the world in this completely different way that civilians can't because they don't think in metaphor, right? They don't have that. They don't have poetry that, they don't have the ability to see the world through poetry. I think as humans, we're multifaceted, right? We wear a lot of hats. I am a teacher, I'm a dad. I'm a partner to my wife, right? I'm a writer, and part of that identity as a writer is as a poet. I also think of myself as a fiction writer. I also think of myself as an essayist. So, am I a poet? Yeah, I'm a poet. But I don't know that that word is loaded. But there is this sort of weight that people put on it, right? They're like, "What do you do?" "Oh, I'm a poet," right? And they're like this is like the end all be all, right? And I don't know any poet who actually thinks of themselves like that, right?
As only a poet.
Yeah. We all have so many identities, right? As people and as artists. Before I came here, I was in community with poets, right? Okay. Because I had a lot of friends who were writing poetry. I think it wasn't until I actually started to figure out, I think I'm going to write poetry now, that I started to try and find my way into community, right, with poets as a poet. When it's not just that I wasn't writing as many poems before I got here. I wasn't writing any poems before I got here. Like I looked at the line break and I was like, why would you do that to a beautiful sentence? Why would you chop up a beautiful sentence into pieces like that? I didn't get it, right? I just did not understand the mechanics of a poem. And then once I figured it out, I was like, oh, well, that makes sense. I can do that. And then the sentence suddenly made more sense to me because I could understand, right, by the way lineation works. Suddenly the sentence made more sense. And I think I'm a stronger writer of prose for writing poetry. I feel like I've lost track of the actual question you asked. Yeah, I came here as a prose writer, right? I was a prose writer. I mean, I was sharing prose, when I was in grad school, because that was just part of what you do. You're in grad school, you write these stories or these essays, and you send them out and try and get them published. So I was doing that, before I got here. I started sending poems out probably in about 2010. I was about a year and a half into figuring out how to write poems, and I just started sending them out and trying to see, well, can I do this, right? Can I find my way into those conversations? Can I find my way into those conversations as someone who is conversant with the genre, right? With the medium. I think it's really easy just to send poems out and not be conversant because you're just shotgunning poems out saying someone publish it, more than, taking the time and saying, these are my poems, right? And really trying to be part of that conversation. I would look to see where the poets that I like were being published, okay, right? And so, I knew that, I knew that I like Amy Nuzigmatatil, so I would and she's still one of my favorite poets, right? But I'd look for her poems. Where is she publishing, right? Maybe I want to be there. Why? Because I want my poems to be in conversation with those poems. And plus, if those kinds of poets, those poets who have been validated by the conversations and by the community are publishing in those places, well, then they must be good, right? They kind of vet themselves that way. I've been really fortunate, I came to Grand Valley in 2008, and at that point, I think Andrew Munson was still here, and Andrew Munson, poet, essayist, and fiction writer, who a year after we got here, he moved to Arizona to take. It's almost like we swapped places. But at the time, Andrew was doing these broadsides for GVSU Poetry Night. And he was also running the writers series for the writing department at Grand Valley. So he was, and he was doing broadsides for those too. So I was really, I have a graphic design background. Before I went back to school to get my undergrad degree, I did graphic design for about 10 years. So I had this design background. So when Ander left, there was no one to do broadsides. So I just said, I'll just do the broadsides. Let me do them. Yeah, the broadsides it's like a little poster or a little flyer, right? And you just put there's a poem on there, usually a graphic, and we would just distribute them for free, right? As sort of a way to commemorate the event. And so I would just make the broadsides. And so I found my way into sort of being a part of those events, even though, I wasn't doing the reading, I wasn't doing the organizing. But as someone who was doing the broadsides, it was a way to be part of that community. I've been lucky. I remember when David Cope was poet laureate, he was so generous to me. He says, I got an email from him one day, and he says, I'm doing this anthology for the, Grand Rapids Poetry. I'd like to put some of your poems in. Send me some poems, right? And I'd only been writing poems for like a year and a half. So I was like, of course, And then he was like, I'm doing this whole poetry conference, and we're going to do these readings. So come and do a poetry reading. I was like, sure, I'll do poetry reading for you, And he was like, maybe you can read like for 40 minutes or so. I was like, 40 minutes? In my head, I'm like, that's a long reading. I don't know anyone who wants to sit in a poetry reading for 40 minutes, but I was like, sure, let's do it. But David was like super generous. I was this guy I'd only been writing poems for a little while, and he just said, come on in. I'll hold the door for you. You have a seat at the table, and just be a poet with us. And it was so generous of him to do that. Patricia Clark has done similar things for me, where Patricia's out there in the world. She's doing great things, and when there were opportunities, she'd say, well, how about Todd here, right? And she'd give me the nod and open the door for me. For me, at least, I feel like Grand Rapids, the poetry scene it's pretty small, but it's been super welcoming to me. Sure, I know. I think the first time I saw, the performance poetry in Grand Rapids, that was, what's the name of that place? The Distillery. Yeah, it was at Long Road. And that was the first night I got to see, the performance poetry in Grand Rapids. And that was awesome. That was so cool. I have kids now, so I can't really get out to events like I used to. But that was really, really cool to see poetry in that other venue, right? In a venue that I'm not used to seeing. I remember GVSU Poetry Night's been another thing. I've gotten to see so many awesome poets come through. I remember there was one year where it was Patty Ann Rogers came to do a reading, and she was supposed to read with Christian Wyman, and Christian got sick and couldn't come. And so Patricia was like, oh, Christian just he has to cancel the last minute. She's like, who should I get? And then she looks at me and goes, how about Lee Young Lee? And I was like, oh, Lee Young Lee? You mean like my poetry hero? You mean like Lee Young Lee, who I learned to write, Lee Young Lee, whose book, like The City in Which I Love You, I learned to write poems by rewriting the poems, right? I was like, yeah, bring Lee Young Lee. And so, I got to have dinner with Lee Young Lee. I'd met him briefly before that, but, I got to, hang out with him and talk to him. There's been so many poets that I've gotten to meet, and maybe they don't remember me. That's fine. I don't expect them to, but I sure remember them. The time that they spend just, talking to me about poems. I've learned as much from having dinner with Lee Young Lee as I have from, talking to anyone in more formal conversations. The thing that I learned about Lee Young Lee is that he's one, he's kind of a rock star, among poets. And yet he's so humble. sometimes he's very humble. Sometimes I think almost to the point of like awkwardness, where like, you're like, dude, you're Lee Young Lee. Just like, just own it and be Young Lee. And he's like, no, he's just super humble. And that was really, really awesome to see. It's awesome to know that, and to remind myself, no matter what we do, sort of, we're always, when we're at the table with someone, we're always just the table mate, right? We're just people talking back and forth, regardless of what we've accomplished. And that's something I think I've learned from just almost every poet that's come through. There might have been exceptions. I'm not going to think about them because I don't want to name names. But like, almost without exception, there's such a generosity there and a welcomingness to those people, those poets. My dad's a poet, so like I knew when I was a kid I was not going to enter the family business. But I'm a creative person, right? So like I entered through music. I played music when I was younger. It was a great time to be a musician in Seattle in the 90s. And then like when I got here, I started writing poems, and poems became that sort of, it took the place of music, right? And I wanted to play rock and roll when I was younger. And I still think of the poem as kind of like rock and roll, right? It does this thing that is transgressive, and yet something that people want to read, right? So at once it's welcoming and transgressive. When you think about like, did poetry find me or did I find poetry? I think I found poetry at first, but then the more I wrote, right, the more poetry has found me. I was thinking about this today. I have more reasons, and I feel like, on the one hand, I feel really lucky to be able to say this, but as I was thinking about it, I think most poets can say this. I have more reasons to write poetry than I have reasons not to write poetry. Like I have one reason not to write poetry because I have a million other things to do, like real life responsibilities. But, for me, poetry, sure, it's self-expression, right? It's that creative outlet, but I'm writing poems for my kids. I am so grateful that I get to go back and read my dad's poems. I get to talk to my dad, right? My dad talks to me in those poems and he's gone. One day, maybe I'll talk to my kids through my poems. Poetry is where I can go, to talk to myself. Poetry is where I can go. My dad shows up in my poems so often. It's like, I always say, poetry is that place where we can resurrect the dead, even though it's just us talking to ourselves, right? Even though that's me on the page, man, I get to talk to my dad in those poems, and we get to have conversations, and it's so valuable to me. I won't give that up for anything. So like, there's this, I'm talking to the ancestors. I'm talking to the future. I'm talking to myself, right? There's just so much that poetry gives me. I can't imagine ever stopping, I just want everyone to know that like their words are more than just like how I'm feeling these other days. Like I see young writers saying, here's my breakup poem, right? Or here's this poem I'm writing about my parents, right? No, you're not writing about your parents. You're having a conversation with them. They're maybe not in the room, right? But that's it. Poetry is this really important way of where, we learn things. Things come to life for us. I think there's no greater joy than, well, there are lots of greater joys, but there's such joy when a poem like comes to life and starts talking to you and starts telling you things. And it sounds totally hocus pocus, right? But there's this point where sometimes a poem is going to reveal things to you that like you didn't know you knew. You didn't know you thought. And you're like, you finish the draft and you're like, oh snap. I had no idea that I felt this way about X, right? Or, oh, I didn't know I felt this way about my dad. And I didn't know he felt that way about me, right? So I think that, when I say poetry's magic, that's ridiculous to say, but I totally mean it. Like the poet Maggie Smith, she talks about a poem as an empathy machine, right? Here's this little machine I'm going to put out in the world, and it's going to create empathy between you and me, between you, the reader, and another person, right? And I think that's so valuable on the one hand, just for that one surface meaning, right? We learn to what it's like to walk in other people's shoes and vice versa, right? But then we're creating shoes, right? We're inventing whole like lines of footwear that's never been invented, right? For people to walk in and people to discover. I mean, that's just a big metaphor that, kind of describes, I think, the power of poems. But I think that, when her poem Good Bones goes viral and, after the Pulse nightclub shooting, right? The Pulse nightclub shooting happens in Orlando. Weeks later, her poem Good Bones goes viral. Why? Because it was saying something to people, and people were discovering something. It was not that they were just understanding something or are moved because of this play of language that helps them, right, to understand something about how crappy the world can be. But like they're discovering something new. They're creating knowledge for themselves, creating understanding for themselves. And I think poetry is super powerful that way, especially when you get it down to that personal level. I think that the me who was writing poems in 2010 is a very different person than the me who's writing poems in 2022, right? I have more kids, way more kids than I did then. I have, my girlfriend at the time is now my wife. I own a house. I have a job that feels pretty stable. I got lots of things I didn't have back then. My dad's no longer with me. That's a big one. So there's so much happens in our lives that changes as people. Often I think those poems feel foreign to me because I don't recognize that person, correct? Because that's not the person that I am now. I don't know if this is answering the question. But, I see things in those poems, I guess, that, I guess more than seeing the things that I knew back then, I see the things that I didn't know back then, okay. I think that, as a young poet, I'm still young, but as a young poet, I came to poetry and just like everybody who's breaking into something new, there's all this stuff that I thought, right? And all this stuff that I knew. And now as I look back at it, I was like, yeah, you didn't really know that, and honestly, I hope that 10 years from now, 15 years from now, I hope I'm still alive. I hope I'm still writing poetry. And I hope I look back at the poems that I'm writing now and say, you know what, you didn't really know what you think you knew. I think that when I get to the point where I can't see that kind of thing, it'll be time to hang it up. Poetry is definitely the medium that has gotten me to new levels of understanding of everything in the world. From how the world works to who I am, right? From the macro to the micro, everything shifts because of poetry. And I hope that, I hope it's going to shift again. I want it to shift constantly. Because that means I'm changing. It means I'm growing. And it means I'm understanding more. It means poetry is going to do its work for me. That's my selfish want from poetry, right? Help me grow, teach me stuff, make me a better person. Do I ever feel like I don't have anything to say? That's a tricky question because right now, I have, right now I have 16-month-old twins and they don't give me any time to do anything, right? So I don't have time to say anything except for go to sleep, eat your dinner, and stay asleep, right? But the answer is yes. Sometimes I don't have anything to say. I'm just tired. I've said a bunch of stuff already. What else do I have to say, right? But the poem helps me discover what else I have to say. I think that if you understand the mechanics of a poem, you can make the poem work. And once you can make the poem work, the poem can start to do its work. So, if I understand how the metaphor works, well, I'm going to start by making a metaphor. And once I make that metaphor, I just hope, I'm crossing my fingers, that the metaphor is going to open up into a poem and I'll discover, oh, there's this thing that I haven't said yet. With my 6-year-old, he's starting to understand what poetry is. All the readings right now are on Zoom. So, every once in a while, my wife's a fiction writer, right? So there are nights where one of us goes upstairs and does a reading on Zoom while the other one does dinner time. And he's like, what's going on? We're working. Right? We're doing these, So he's starting to understand like the life of being a poet or a writer who works. I'm trying to engage him with poetry, but I'm not going to force it. He's gonna discover it or he's not. I don't expect him to love it right off the bat. I want him to. I hope that he will. But he'll come to poetry when it's time for him, I guess. Like I resisted for so long. I was like, I just don't want to end. My dad's a poet. I don't want that kind of competition. I don't want to always be like, wanting my dad's approval of my poems. And I fought as long as I could. But here I am. It was inevitable. I was a preliminary judge for 1 year for Diary Ives. I know lots of people who've worked on it or submitted or sometimes won. I've worked on the committees to select the Grand Rapids Poet Laureate for the last 3 laureates. So I was on the committee that selected L.S. Klatt, the committee that selected Marcel Price, and the one that selected our current laureate, Kyd Kane. You might have heard of her. So like that's some of the work that I've done for our city. I mean, it's part of, when I say that David Cope was very generous in opening doors for me, as welcoming me to the table. It's part of what I want to do, with as a writer in Grand Rapids. What doors can I help open, right? How can I help, a new poet laureate get seated? How can I help a new poet laureate get their projects done? How can I help facilitate that kind of work? It's what I'm interested in. One of the things I'm interested in doing. I'm more interested in helping a poet laureate in our city than I am actually in being laureate myself. I brought one poem. This is a pretty new poem. I hope it's going to be in what will be a book sometime soon. This is called America for My Heart. I've got a handgun for a heart, an ambulance siren for a name. America announces itself outside my bedroom window every morning, and the awful things that have happened in this life. Church fires and school murders, drone strikes and hanging bodies, the sound a family makes together when the landscape has swallowed all their ghosts. I got lightning in my mouth, a plume of smoke instead of a winter coat. It's snowing heavy and dark silhouettes of trees look like skeletons shivering in America. My son is afraid to sleep by himself without a nightlight, even though I've told him monsters aren't real, even though I'm lying down close to him. He has an apple for a heart, an orchard for a heart, a mouthful of teeth that can say the names of extinct creatures and bring them back to life. I've got a samurai sword for a name, chopsticks for a name, a kamikaze plane for a name given to me by a barbed wire fence, by train tracks, by stories of children in concentration camps in Idaho and Texas. I've got a graveyard for a heart, a single weathered tombstone with a name on it, America, and the animals howl in grief. Saber-toothed cats, woolly mammoths, huge flightless birds, all singing songs about how it feels to be left for dead, about how beautiful it would be to live again. I am, on the one hand, blessed. I get to work with young people, right, who want to write poems. People just don't, if you're paying tuition at Grand Valley, you're not just going to spend tuition on this thing that you don't want to do, unless it's like a required course. But no one's forced to take poetry, right? So I'm super lucky to be able to work with so many young, gifted, hardworking writers who want to write poetry. And it, when I think about, what I talked about before about how, people opened doors for me and made room for me at the table of poetry. That's what I hope to do with my students too. I want to open poetry to them and say, here's this thing you can do. Here's this thing you can do. Here's how I work it. You'll figure out how to work it yourself if you want to, right? And just show them that that's a possibility, regardless of who you are, what you look like, who you love, how you identify, how much money you make, where you come from, what people say about you, I want to give them that. And that, I do my best in my classes to give them that. And I hope they walk away with it, because if they can walk away with it and develop it, I think that they're better people for it. I want them to know everything that I've learned, right, from poetry. But I want them to learn it for themselves, right? They're going to have, when I say that poetry means all these things to me, I want them to discover what poetry means to them, right? And that's how they'll discover that, that poetry really is magic. Who I am is I think I learned things about how poems work by understanding how songs work. But I think as a writer, I deliberately stay away from the kinds of things that songs do structurally. Of course, there are things that, I do, like repetition, right? Repetition has a certain power to it, but like it works differently, I think, in songs. So yeah, weirdly, I spent, 10 years of my life writing songs and playing music, on the circuit in Seattle. But I've kind of left that, right? That's kind of not what I'm trying to do, even though I've learned a ton about poetry from writing songs. Because the song works sonically in ways that a page poem doesn't. That is, a poem doesn't have a musical accompaniment, right? Naturally. That's not to say that the poem doesn't have music, right? But the poem the song is entirely sonic and rhythmic. So that's why that end rhyme is so important. And that's why that repetition in the chorus is so important, because that's what drives the song home. And that's what, right, instills the poem in sort of the ear of the listener. That's how the earworm gets into the ear. And that's why the song sticks with us. It's that sonic quality of the song, whereas the poem has these other things working for it. And I think that the poem should have a sonic quality. But like when you're at the club and listening to that song comes on right over the speakers, you're not looking at the lyrics, right? You're not seeing that language. You're interfacing with that language on a different level. So, when I'm thinking of lyrics, there's that sonic and rhythmic quality that comes first. When I'm writing poems, it's generally speaking, when I'm writing poems, that's not what comes first. It's other things, the image, the line. Where's the sentence going, and how does that work against the line, right? I guess there's similar things, but with very different toolboxes for me. But I guess the process is the same. You sit down with your guitar and you noodle, and you're just trying to figure out, is that a line? Is that a riff? Am I gonna go with that riff? What comes after that riff? Which is kind of like writing a poem. You put a line down. Well, what's the next line? And what's the line after that? Just kind of hoping that the poem lines up. So I think every poem for me is disposable at the beginning. I gotta this is disposable. I'm not keeping it, right? And so that frees me up. I want the poem to be anything too, but then at some point I'm like, do I want this to be my poem, right? At some point I'm like, yeah, I can keep going with this, but I don't really want it, And then I have to decide, well, am I going to jettison it? Probably, because the draft is disposable. Or am I going to I'm going to force it into something? And I'd rather try and let the poem find its own way. No, I think I get stuff, because if it's disposable, then I don't right? If it's disposable, then the draft doesn't matter. And if the draft doesn't matter, I can do anything, right? Sky's the limit. You know, I can write a poem in rhymed, quatrains. I can do that. Why? Because it's disposable. No one's ever going to see it, right? And if it works, it works. If it doesn't, well, it doesn't. And I get more. I think I get more hits than misses. Did I learn something? Is the poem talking back to me? Right? All that stuff we talked about before. Like, is the poem giving me something I didn't know before? Right? Am I discovering some emotional resonance I didn't know was possible? If the poem doesn't do that, I think it's a failure to me. Or if it's not a failure, it's not doing what I want it to do, right? So I think that's how I know. I mean, I know there's poems that I don't like as much that I've had published. But that isn't to say that they're bad poems, right? It isn't to say that they're not working. But I'm always looking for that thing, like, how is the poem talking to me? How is the poem teaching me something I didn't know before? And if it can do that, then that's success to me. That's what I'm looking for. So I've really only collaborated with one other poet. That's Amorak Huey, also here in Grand Rapids.
2 books, right?
We wrote a textbook together, and then that chapbook of poems called ///. That happened because I was writing these poems about Guns N' Roses, the band, and he was writing these poems about Guns N' Roses, the band. One day he texts me, he goes, "We're both writing these poems about Guns N' Roses. We should just write them together." I was like, okay, let's do it. And so, at that point, I'd already written this textbook with him. And so we had this idea of how to work together. As collaborators, like, we were just like, can we just put our egos aside? No ego, right? And let's just write poems and not worry about who owns it. We were like, let's take ego out of the equation and relinquish ownership completely of these poems. And so we just created this Google document, and I'd write a poem. I'd be like, well, that was not very good. Hoping more I can do something with it, right? So, I learned how to make the poem even more disposable, right? Because I knew that this guy that I trusted would be able to do something with it. So sometimes I felt like I'm just going to try and can I throw a ball like right over the plate for him to hit, right? Like, if I'm a pitcher, can I just like give him something to hit, right? Make it easy for him. Or like, I just don't know what to do with this. I wrote this thing. Maybe he'll see something. And the result was really cool because I'd send him this poem and be like, I don't know what to do with this. And he'd send it back. And I'd be like, oh my gosh, this thing is beautiful. How'd you do it, right? And he's like, well, you did this, this, and this. And he just showed me what I did, right? And I'd do the same thing. He'd send me a draft, and I'd just like take it and tear it apart and send him this brand new poem back. And as a result, we have this book of poems where, for the most part, we can't distinguish who wrote what poem. We can't distinguish who made what edits to what poems. I think that there are certain things we say, yeah, I did this thing and that kind of went through the whole book, and he did this thing and it went through the whole book, right? And we just kind of incorporated that decision to some of the other poems. But for the most part, those poems are 100% collaborative. Like, we don't even know who wrote which poems. And so they're just our poems. And it's really, really weird, but it's really cool to be able to look at that poem and say, yeah, I don't know. I know I wrote this, but I also know I didn't write this. There's no record of like, here's the first draft, here's the second draft. It's just all like, here's the poem, do something with it. And then he'd send it back and I'd send it back. And, the goal was just can we just make awesome poems and have it not be about us? It's about the poetry. And it was a cool thing. I've learned so much about how to work by myself because I had the chance to work with Amorak Huey collaboratively at Grand Valley. His office is right across the hall from mine. He started, I think, maybe the same year that I did, both on semester by semester contracts. I still think of myself as a Seattle guy, but I'm also a Midwest guy now. I'm a Midwest poet. I learned to write poems. I started writing poems here in Grand Rapids, and I wouldn't be writing poetry. I wouldn't be the artist that I am today if I lived anywhere else. My experiences here in the Midwest, in Grand Rapids specifically, have given me the opportunities, these formative opportunities to become a poet.